The world is a crazy place. It is, it always has been, it always will be. But today, we don't care about that. We are jumping back in time to the year 1972, Reykjavik, Iceland, World Championship match, Boris Spassky versus Bobby Fischer. This is game 6. The current score is 2.5, 2.5. Fischer lost the first game, forfeited the second game, and then caught up. And this was a pivotal moment of the match where Fischer took the lead. Not only did he take the lead, he did it by detonating pawn to c4. If you know anything about Fischer, he did not play the English opening. He played e4. This is his only third time in tournament chess playing c4, and it was a positional masterpiece. Bobby Fischer was the first person in chess, I believe, to not just study chess, but to study his opponents. He had a book of all of Spassky's recorded games, and he just read it over and over and over again before the match. Memorized everything, learned his play style. He did so much that he felt comfortable bringing it into Spassky's bread and butter and then surprising him and then winning a wonderful game. So the game starts with pawn to c4, the English defense. It transposes into a queen's gambit. Are we going to get a declined? Are we going to get an accepted? Well, back in the day, you were considered a coffee house player or kind of a scrub. That's what they called them, though, coffee house player, if you tried to hold on to the pawn. Nowadays, with computers, they've figured out a way to hold on to this. This just looks gross, though, and this is not how chess was played back then. The game changes over time, as we know, a lot. So we get a queen's gambit declined, and now we get a Tartakower, bishop to g5. We get castles e3, both sides developing, a lot of tension in the center. We will see where the game heads. Okay, now h6. There are two theoretical moves here. There's going into the Tartakower, bishop to h4, and then there's what I prefer, the anti-Tartakower, bishop takes f6. The reason I prefer bishop takes f6 is 1, it's less studying, less theory. 2, eventually you're told to take the pawn on d5. But if this knight is here, the knight is able to recapture. And I like to argue that after bishop takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, I like to argue that my dark squared pawn chain is blocking out the bishop. I think that's a stupid bishop. And I think it's a really easy position for white to play. And it's very possible. I believe it's played 25% of the time. The other 75%, we get into bishop to h4. And that was what was played in this game. Pawn to b6. Now, can you believe this move has nothing to do with developing the light squared bishop? Typically, when you see this fianchetto pawn structure, it's to get the light squared bishop there to patch the light squared weaknesses. However, the Tartakower, a weird word, is all about going c5, and after the exchanges, we get these hanging pawns in the center. Black gets a pawn on d5 and c5, no pawns on the e file or the b file. It's kind of like a unit of an isolated pawn when you have hanging pawns in the center. Rather than one open file, you get two beautiful open files. The more pieces there are on the board, the more dynamic and the better the hanging pawns are. The closer we get to an endgame, the weaker the pawns. I'm going to stop talking about it in a position ahead so you guys can understand it once it is on the board. We get c takes d5, opening up the c file, and knight takes d5. See, take on d5, they take with the knight. We get a capture of bishops and now a clarification in the center of the board. So another way to play. By the way, I added the eval bar like some of you guys asked. I think that was a good idea. The funny thing about d4 is it is so different than e4. You make almost every move and it is equal. We'll discuss at various points in the game. Rook to c1, claiming the semi-open file, aiming at c7, and bishop to e6 developing. Now we get queen a4. And this move at face value doesn't look like it does too much. Maybe it stops the knight from coming to c6, though the rook already did that. Maybe when the pawn comes to c5, the knight still can't come to c6. Let's see what this move is about. Can you think of white's next move? It has to do with his last move, queen a4. I don't think this stands out at all, but it's one of those moves where once it's on the board, it makes sense. Queen to a3, a backwards queen move in the middle of the game. How could this be? Why could this be? Well, what it does is it pins the c-pawn to the queen. And this is a pesky move. You make this move and your opponent's like, that's an annoying move I have to deal with. Granted, back then, they are still in theory. I'll let you guys know when it's a novelty or a new move getting out of theory. But still, at face value, this is an odd move. If you're not a grandmaster and you don't know 25 moves of theory, like most people, then this is a good move. Queen a3, it's an annoying move. Rook f to c8, guarding his hanging pawns, leaving this rook here on the queen side as well. I'd like to argue that this knight is pretty awkward, and we get bishop to b5. Reason we get bishop to b5 is if knight d7, we would get bishop d7. And I would argue that this is a better knight than that is a bishop. And remember, the more trades, the weaker the hanging pawns. They will be hanging once we get d takes c5. a6. Does that threaten the bishop? No, because the rook is pinned, or the pawn is pinned to the rook, rather. So we get takes, and here are the infamous hanging pawns. So they're hard to push, not just because they're pinned, but because every time you push a pawn, you create weaknesses, right? If this pawn goes to c4, b4, and d4 are weak. If this pawn goes to d4, c4, and e4 are weak. But when they're together, they control a lot of squares in the center, and if we can claim the b file, or if black rather can claim the b file, there's some activity there. We get castles, rook a7. This is an important move to digest. What this move does is it unpins the pawn from the rook. See, now the queen guards the rook. So if pawn takes bishop, you lose a bishop because you can no longer take the rook because it is defended. Also, maybe it can double up on c7 if need be. Right, we're never going to take this pawn, even if the knight is there. We're never going to take the pawn and pin our bishop. That would be a poison pawn for the rest of the game. Okay, now, where does this bishop go? Where would you put this bishop? There's no wrong answers. You can say bishop to a4 because you don't want the knight to move and you don't care about aiming at a6. You could say bishop d3 because they cannot really play c4, or you're not scared of c4 rather. And you could do what Fischer did, which is bishop e2. Fischer was not a passive player. Bishop e2 is not a passive move, though it looks like one. What do you think the reasoning behind bishop e2 is? I believe the reasoning behind bishop a2 is something like bishop g4 could be played by black. And what is white to do? Where does this knight go? It doesn't feel normal to double up the g-pawns. And if you move this knight, where's it going to route to? It doesn't have many good squares. You could argue that it could go to d2 and then b3. Fair to say, but then the queen is kind of locked. Again, you see the bar. Everything is equal in d4. But I believe he went bishop e2 because now bishop g4 wouldn't make sense because you can always recapture it. So I think that's why bishop e2 is played. Knight to d7, developing, and now we leave theory. We get a so-called novelty, I believe. I don't think it was played before this. You know what I wonder? I wonder if they were blitzing these moves out because it was theory, or if Spassky was like, whoa, this guy just detonated c4 on me. He is an e4 player. What is happening? What do you think white's move is here? Again, everything is equal, but there's more aggressive equal moves. That is knight to d4. See, this bishop no longer sees the rook, so that is a pin on the c file. That is a double pin on the c file. Not only is the rook pinned, but the queen is pinned. Spassky, I believe, here was out of theory, and what all people do when they're out of theory, they don't play the best chess. So we get queen f8, a logical move, unpinning the queen, also unpinning the rook. So now you got to deal with this. So of course we get knight takes bishop, f takes e6. Kind of looks like a reversed Grunfeld structure, shifted over a little bit, right? Grunfeld would be c3, d4, e4, e6, d5, c5. Looks similar to me. I don't know. That's what comes to my head, at least. Could be, I don't know. That's what comes to my head. It is a Grunfeld structure in the center of the board, a weird pawn structure. Now, you need to play active, and Fischer did just that. How do you challenge the integrity of the pawn structure? Well, you go pawn to e4, a beautiful positional move. Here's where the tables really turn, and Spassky does not play his best chess. Okay, the engine is insane here. When I was reviewing this game, you know what it recommended? It recommended d takes e4. No serious chess player would even consider taking this pawn, because now you have 4 isolated pawns that are going to become backwards, and white has not moved a pawn. He can commit to anything he wants in the future. Basically, white is going to build up on the weaknesses, win 1 pawn, and then black is going to be left with 3 gross pawns. And they're always going to be gross pawns because they're never connected. What Spassky should have done is either go knight to f6 or queen to d6. But he didn't want to because the game was getting close to an endgame and he didn't want hanging pawns in the center. So he went pawn to d4. I'm not going to say that's logical. It just looks bad. How do you punish that? You go pawn to f4. What this does is it stops pawn to e5 because now you could get f takes e5. You aim at the queen. You're going to get bishop c4. It's not a pretty pawn, but it's a pawn and it could be defended. So pawn to f4, what does Spassky do? He goes queen e7, getting out of the potential discovered attack on the queen, and we get pawn to e5. Another positional beauty. Can you explain this move? Why do you think e5 is such a good move? The reason being is you have a light squared bishop, so you control the light squares on the board. They do not have a light squared bishop, so they do not control the light squares on the board. So you isolate their pawn on a light square. That is a weakness, an eternal weakness, I like to say. A static weakness. It's never going to change unless you decide to change it. And that gives white an easy plan and black a hard task to manage. We get rook to b8, aiming at the open file, semi-open file, aiming at the b pawn. Fischer goes bishop c4, aiming at the e pawn. And we get king h8, unpinning the king from the pawn. Maybe we'd get f5 in the future. Who knows? Queen to h3, a beauty. So now you're aiming in at the isolated pawn. And what Spassky should have done here, remember, change the pawn structure, is rook takes b2. When you're losing, change the pawn structure. Reason being is you gain a pawn. Yes, you gain a pawn. You have a rook on the second. And of course, white is still winning, but it's hard to change gears. Fischer would have done it, but it's hard to change gears. This would have been black's best bet. What you do not want to do when you're getting squeezed is resort to passive defense, like knight to f8, right? This move just looks gross. This just cannot be good. Doesn't look like we're trending forward. Pawn to b3. And the amazing thing about Fischer is he got a massive advantage and then he just switched to like perfection. Like he was just a perfectionist. He made it so his opponent cannot move a single piece, and then he improved his position when his opponent could not make any progress. It was just amazing. He just waited so long to strike, but he got his position as good as it could be and then struck. Fascinating. Great player. Goat. Pawn to f5. Changing the pawn structure. What do you take with? Well, you take with the rook, because then that allows you to get your other pieces into the game. Yes, you have a hanging pawn in the center of the board, but that is a passed pawn. That is a passed pawn, and Fischer will use it. So we get rook to f1. Oh, quick question. Why is rook f7 a blunder? Doesn't that just win a rook? No. The point of knight h7 was to hope for rook to f7. You see, black can play the move knight to g5, forking white. And now, if white is to take the queen, this comes with check, which is the problem. And all of a sudden, black is winning. A tragedy that would be. But he doesn't blunder that, thankfully. We get rook to f1, doubling up. Now, queen to d8 and queen g3. Maybe there's going to be a discovered attack if it ties the queen down to the rook, aims at the king. This is a nice queen. And we're going to see the positional reason, that is pawn to h4. Not allowing black to jump into the game, not allowing his pieces to move. This is where he really started to squeeze Spassky so that he could not move any of his pieces. Rook to b7, pawn to e6. Now this rook is stuck. This knight is stuck. I don't know what this rook is doing. Who knows? Rook c7 is going to c7. Who knows? Queen to e5. There's many ways to win this, but I like queen to e5, pinning the g-pawn to the king, centralizing the queen. It's aiming at a lot. It's doing a lot. That is a beautiful queen. Queen e8, and now we get pawn a4. See, just shutting down any openings into the position. If there's openings, rooks become good. So he doesn't allow any openings. He closes down the position. And again, it is hard for black to move. So now we're at move 34. At move 40, they gain time on the clock. Maybe they were low on the clock. So right now, Fischer just goes back and forth because he can. Spassky goes back and forth because he has to. There's a big difference. Queen e8, rook f3, and bishop to d3. So move 36, getting closer and closer to time control. And look, he sets up a tactic on move 37. Queen to e4. Beautiful. A backwards bishop move, a backwards queen move. Why can this rook not take the bishop right now? Well, if this rook takes the bishop, there is mate in 3. Do you see it? The move is rook to f8, and if knight takes rook, rook takes, check, queen takes, you remove the queen or the knight from guarding h7 for a reason, for a battery checkmate, a double rook sacrifice. Spassky saw that, but too little too late. Honestly, he should have just let him have it. Would have been a beautiful ending. But the ending is also beautiful. Knight to f6, what do? The only brilliance of the game, rook takes knight. It is time. Your pieces are perfect. Black's pieces are stuck. Get rid of the knight, sack a rook, open up the king, you're crushing. We get king to g8 and bishop to c4. Many ways to win. You might say, why not rook g6 check? And well, rook g7, you don't want to trade rooks. Look at his rooks, look at your rook. Bishop c4, the correct decision, I believe. Pinning the rook down to e7, guarding the pawn. It's in the same diagonal as the king. You're threatening rook to f7, which would be a beauty. And things are bad for black. Now, you could take rook takes h6. You will win, but he was a perfectionist. He chose queen f4. Spassky resigned because there is no way to stop rook f8 check. This rook cannot move. This rook moving does nothing. There is mate. Black resigns. A beautiful, beautiful game. And this was a huge psychological game. It was the turning point of the match where Fischer took the lead. It is now 3.5, 2.5. Obviously, we know who became world champion. He took down the Russian school of chess. It was just a crazy time back then. I hope you enjoyed the game. Bobby Fischer, the GOAT. Let me know what game you want me to do next time. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great day.